The rumbling descent of our landing craft stirred a thick plume of orange dust, and for a moment, Titan's unearthly landscape was hidden from view. Through the reinforced glass of my helmet, I watched as the haze settled, revealing the stark panorama of an alien moon. Titan's sky, perpetually smothered in smog and methane, cast everything in a dim, sickly light that seemed to seep into my bones. The landing crew, composed of 6 seasoned members, each hardened by years of exploring the unknown, stood silent. Dr. Miriam Ellis, the mission leader, took the first step onto the icy crust. Her every movement exuded a resolve that dared Titan itself to challenge her. I followed, my boots crunching down onto terrain that had been untouched by human feet until this very moment. We were here on what had initially been classified as a geological survey. Months of analysis had suggested seismic activity beneath the moon's frozen exterior, a possible sign of subsurface oceans, perhaps even life. But the true impetus for this mission was the anomaly. A black mark, unlike any geological formation, first spotted by an unmanned drone. Now it loomed before us, undeniable and foreboding. The spire rose from the ice like an accusing finger pointed at the heavens, its surface as black as obsidian and carved with symbols that seemed to twist when looked at directly. I felt my stomach churn, a wave of nausea breaking over me as my eyes tried to process the impossible curves and jagged lines. "Team, check your equipment," Ellis's voice crackled in our headsets, masking her apprehension under layers of professionalism. She moved forward, tracing a gloved finger across one of the symbols. Her head tilted slightly, as if she could hear something beyond the static of our comms. The wind picked up, moaning across the empty expanse like the ghost of a forgotten world. My heart thudded against my chest as I joined Ellis and the others in a tight semicircle around the spire. Dr. Lucas Kearns, our xenobiologist and the youngest on the team, clicked his tongue, eyes alight with a mixture of awe and fear. "These markings, they're not just decorative," he muttered. "They're purposeful." Before anyone could respond, Ellis pressed her palm firmly against the largest of the carvings. There was a moment of silence so profound that I could hear my own breath fogging the inside of my helmet. Then, with a sound like ancient wood splintering under pressure, a seam appeared. It ran vertically down the length of the spire, splitting open as though the stone had lips that had been sealed shut for millennia. A metallic luminous mist spilled from the crack, shimmering like mercury as it swirled around our boots. A shiver ran up my spine. The air seemed to hum, alive with a low frequency that resonated in my teeth and made my vision pulse. It was then that I understood that what we had found was not a structure, but a doorway. "Ellis, we need to document this properly before proceeding," Kearns said, his voice trembling as the mist coiled around his ankles like sentient fog. "There won't be another chance," Ellis snapped, the edge of her voice carving through his protest. She turned to the group, eyes alight with a fervor that was almost unsettling. "Gear up, we're going in." The silence that followed was laden with unspoken fears. Still, we were explorers, scientists forged in the crucible of discovery and bound by a silent contract to press on. I swallowed hard as we activated our suit lights and stepped into the breach one by one, crossing the threshold into darkness. The temperature dropped sharply as the light from our suits illuminated the narrow passage before us. It was lined with the same glyphs as the spire outside, their designs impossibly intricate, mocking the human concept of symmetry. The walls glistened, not with moisture, but with a strange, bioluminescent slime that pulsed faintly as if in time with a hidden heartbeat. The passage spiraled downward, constricting our group to single file. The only sound was the mechanical wheeze of our breath regulators and the occasional shuffle of boots on slick stone. The deeper we moved, the tighter the space became, until the air felt suffocating, pressing against the confines of my suit like a second skin. Dr. Anders, our geologist, was the first to break the silence. These formations shouldn't exist, not naturally, not on Titan. A sense of vertigo swept over me as the floor finally leveled out into a cavernous chamber. The space was vast, beyond what our limited lights could fully reveal, and covered in a lattice of glowing veins that wound across the floor, up the walls, and into the ceiling where they seemed to disappear into an inky abyss. At the center of the chamber stood an altar. It was not shaped like the primitive relics we had seen on Earth, but rather like a contorted bloom, its petals jagged and lined with razor-thin protrusions. Perched at the altar's heart was an object that defied reason. A translucent sphere, no larger than a human head, containing swirling clouds that moved with deliberate purpose. A cold chill crawled up my back as I realized the sphere seemed aware of us, as though it could see us standing there, tiny and fragile beneath its watchful presence. "What the hell is that?" Kearns's voice cracked, the last word splintering like glass. But before anyone could answer, his trembling hand reached forward, fingers drawn to the sphere as if under a spell. "Don't touch it." Ellis's command came too late. Kearns's gloved fingers brushed the surface, and the sphere responded with a pulse of light so blinding that it scorched the colors from the room and left only searing white in its wake. The chamber itself seemed to sigh, an ancient exhalation that rattled the walls and set the glowing veins pulsing furiously. Something in the dark stirred, stretching, waking, and as the light receded, I wished with every fiber of my being that we had never come to this god-forsaken moon, because in that moment Titan awoke with us in its grasp, and nothing would ever be the same. The chamber's pulse reverberated through my bones, an oppressive rhythmic thrum that seemed to grow louder with each breath. The luminous veins lining the walls flashed in erratic intervals, casting jagged, shifting shadows across the space. Kearns had collapsed, his body crumpled near the altar, eyes wide and unblinking. The sphere he had touched now glowed with an otherworldly intensity, the dark clouds within it churning like a storm trapped in glass. "Get him up," Ellis barked, the tension in her voice fraying as she moved to pull Kearns away from the altar. I stumbled forward, my hands trembling as I grasped his arm. His skin felt cold through the thick material of his suit, and for a moment I feared he was already gone. But then he twitched, a violent, involuntary shudder, and his lips parted in a silent scream that sent a chill racing down my spine. "He's alive," I said, my voice hoarse, though the revelation brought no relief. The floor beneath us trembled as if the chamber itself was waking up, disturbed by our intrusion. A low, guttural sound echoed around us, an almost animalistic growl that came not from any one direction, but from the very stone that encased us. "Lights on, full," Ellis commanded. The room brightened momentarily, and for the first time, we could see the true scale of the space we had entered. It was vast, its walls disappearing into the gloom above, but what stood out were the carvings, thousands of them, etched deep and haphazardly across the stone, overlapping like the scrawls of a madman. They depicted things that defied logic, twisted forms with too many limbs, eyes where there should be mouths, grotesque beings locked in battle, and others that appeared to writhe in agony. A shiver ran down my spine as I traced the patterns with my gaze. Each depiction felt purposeful, deliberate, as if created by a mind that understood suffering on a cosmic scale. I glanced at Dr. Anders, who stood staring at the carvings with a look of pale horror. He muttered something under his breath that my ears struggled to catch. "What did you say?" I asked, stepping closer. "They're warnings," he whispered. "These aren't just art. They're stories, records of something terrible." The air in the chamber seemed to vibrate with Anders's words, and suddenly the realization of our situation sank in. We were not the discoverers. We were intruders. The pulse of the room grew louder, and the sound began to morph, evolving from a steady thrum into a strange, tonal hum that reverberated in my skull. "Move! We need to move!" Ellis's voice cut through the growing panic as she pointed to an opening at the far side of the chamber. It was narrow, almost hidden between two jagged columns of stone, but it was the only way deeper into the structure, a way that promised both answers and danger. I helped lift Kearns, his limbs limp but pliable, as we half-dragged him toward the opening. His eyes fluttered and he let out a gasp that seemed torn from his throat. "It's awake," he rasped, his voice distorted and hollow through the calms. "It's in my head." "Keep moving," Ellis urged, her tone sharp and strained as we squeezed through the passageway. The hum followed us, a constant companion that seemed to resonate with the pulse of the veins in the walls. We descended, the path winding deeper into the ancient structure, and with each step the air grew colder, biting through the insulated layers of our suits. The tunnel walls narrowed, forcing us to move single file, and the only illumination came from the flickering light of the bioluminescent veins. Their eerie glow cast everything in an unnatural greenish hue, painting our faces in ghostly shades. The glyphs continued down the walls, their meanings as elusive and unsettling as before. Dr. Anders, who had taken point behind Ellis, suddenly stopped and held up a gloved hand. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice brittle with anxiety. I strained my senses, and there it was, a vibration, subtle but present, beneath my feet. It wasn't just the thrum, it was movement. Something was shifting in the stone itself. Suddenly, the floor shuddered, and a low rumble echoed through the corridor. The walls seemed to ripple, the glyphs moving as if alive. The glow of the veins intensified, blinding us for a moment. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to steady my breath, and that's when I felt it. A faint brushing sensation, almost like fingertips skittering across my arm through the fabric of my suit. "Ellis, we need to get out of here," I shouted, my voice a mix of desperation and panic. She turned to respond, but before she could, the stone beneath us groaned, and the floor dropped, splitting open like a jaw. The world tilted, and I fell, arms flailing as gravity pulled me into the blackness below. The screams of my teammates echoed around me as we plummeted, the bioluminescent veins casting flickering light that disoriented my senses. The descent felt endless, a tunnel carved into the heart of Titan itself. And then, with a sudden, bone-jarring impact, the world stopped. I lay still, the metallic taste of blood sharp in my mouth as I tried to process where I was. The faint sounds of movement reached my ears. Groans, whispers, the hiss of breath caught in throats. I turned my head, vision swimming, and saw Ellis pushing herself up, her face pale and streaked with sweat. The glow of the veins surrounded us, illuminating the room we had fallen into. A vast, circular chamber with walls lined in that same writhing language. But this chamber was different. It was alive. The center of the floor was split open, revealing a chasm filled with a viscous black substance that reflected the light like polished onyx. From its depths, something moved, something with the glisten of wet scales and limbs too numerous to count. It rose slowly, the room trembling as it ascended, and when it opened what I could only describe as an eye the size of a man's torso, I knew that we had awoken something that should have remained buried. The hum that had haunted us now became a roar, the sound of the cosmos itself tearing as the creature fixed its gaze on us. The chamber seemed to shrink as the creature emerged, its form vast and incomprehensible. It was a mass of writhing limbs, slick and glistening with a black, tar-like substance that oozed and slithered across the floor. Veins of bioluminescence reflected on its surface, creating an illusion that it was wrapped in a shroud of living stars. The eye at its center swiveled, massive and ancient, an orb that shone with an intelligence far beyond human understanding. I couldn't move. None of us could. The weight of its gaze pinned us down, an invisible force pressing on my chest, crushing the breath from my lungs. The hum in the chamber grew louder, resonating deep within my skull, vibrating through the hollow spaces of my body until it became an agony that stole coherent thought. Kearns convulsed violently beside me, his helmeted head jerking as he gasped for air. His eyes, still open and unfocused, glistened with fear as they darted about, unseeing. The creature's many limbs shifted, moving as though tasting the air, and I realized with a sick jolt that they were not random appendages. They were appendages tipped with sensory organs, delicate searching. Ellis scrambled to her feet, her gloved hand reaching for the sidearm strapped to her suit. It was a futile gesture, an instinct born of human arrogance. What use was a weapon against something that defied all understanding? She aimed, her breath ragged in the comms, and squeezed the trigger. A sharp crack echoed in the chamber, followed by the brief sizzle of a projectile ricocheting harmlessly off the stone walls. The creature's eye flickered, and then came the sound, a deep, resonant growl that rose from the pit of the chasm like a storm. The glowing veins around us pulsed in sync with the noise, flashing bright and dim in an erratic dance that only heightened our disorientation. The vibrations intensified, rattling my teeth and setting my pulse racing. I gritted my teeth, squeezing my eyes shut as the pressure in my skull threatened to burst it open. And then I heard it. A voice that wasn't a voice, an echo of thought that scraped across the inside of my mind like a claw. Words, though not in any language I recognized, crashed over me in waves. They were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that made no sense. Sacrifice, awakening, hunger. Dr. Anders was the first to break under the pressure. He screamed, a high, keening wail that dissolved into wet, choking sobs as he sank to his knees. His suit vibrated violently, and I could see droplets of blood spattering against the inside of his visor as the capillaries in his eyes burst. He clawed at his helmet, nails scraping the reinforced glass, leaving streaks of crimson. The creature's limbs shifted, focusing on Anders. One appendage, glistening and thick as a tree trunk, reached out and wrapped around him with a sickening, squelching sound. He didn't even have time to react before it lifted him effortlessly into the air, dragging him toward the black, glistening chasm. I wanted to scream, to move, but my body refused, my muscles locked, paralyzed by a terror so profound it rooted me to the spot. Ellis's voice snapped through the comms, shaky but defiant. "We need to get out of here now. Whatever it takes, we move." Her words pierced through the thick, suffocating fog in my brain, sparking a surge of adrenaline. I forced my legs to respond, stumbling backward, my limbs sluggish as though fighting through water. Kearns's eyes fluttered and he moaned, a sound that sent another shiver down my spine. The eye of the creature swiveled again, passing over us before locking onto Ellis. It paused, almost as if considering, and in that moment the air crackled with a cold, sharp energy. The bioluminescent veins pulsed a brilliant white, and then the walls began to split, thin fissures spreading like spider webs, leaking more of the tar-like substance. The chamber groaned as if alive, its stone walls straining and shifting. The creature released Anders's lifeless body into the pit, and his scream cut off abruptly, swallowed by the dark. The air was thick with the metallic tang of fear, and I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, a drumbeat of panic. "Here!" Ellis shouted, motioning to an outcropping of stone that led toward a dark corridor branching off from the main chamber. It was barely wide enough for us to squeeze through, but it was an escape, and that was enough. I moved, my body running on instinct as the hum rose to a crescendo that made my vision swim. Kearns stumbled behind me, his breath coming in ragged, terrified bursts. The veins lining the walls followed us, their glow dimming and flaring as if the creature were aware of our every move. I dared a glance over my shoulder and wished I hadn't. The creature's limbs were retracting, but not out of retreat. They were reforming, twisting into shapes that mirrored the grotesque carvings on the walls, twisted, suffering figures that seemed to weep as they moved. Ellis pushed Kearns ahead of her, her face tight with grim determination as we entered the corridor. The creature roared again, a sound that felt like it was dragging my consciousness with it, pulling at my mind as though it were a physical thing. The corridor shook as we ran, chunks of stone falling and shattering around us. Kearns stumbled, nearly collapsing, but I grabbed his arm and hauled him forward, my fingers digging into the material of his suit. The passage wound and twisted, leading us away from the roar, away from the pulsing glow, and deeper into darkness that was absolute. Behind us, the roar faded, but the silence that followed was worse. It was a silence that whispered promises of despair, a silence that held the weight of eons. It filled the corridor, seeping into my mind like oil, thick and suffocating. Ellis panted as she came to a halt, pressing her back against the wall. Her eyes met mine, wide with unspoken questions. I couldn't look away from the fear mirrored there. It was the same fear that had settled in my chest, an icy realization that whatever we had woken, whatever cosmic horror had been imprisoned here, was now free, and we were the ones who had unleashed it. The veins on the walls continued to glow faintly, their erratic pulse a sinister reminder that the creature was still near, watching, waiting. The only thing more terrifying than the roar of an ancient being was the silence that came after, a silence that spoke of things worse than death. We sat huddled in the darkness of the narrow corridor, our breaths ragged, eyes darting at every flicker of the bioluminescent veins. The once dim glow had turned a sickly yellow, pulsing like the heartbeat of something diseased. The silence was suffocating, wrapping around us like the icy tendrils of a forgotten sea. The only sound was the soft, erratic clicks of the creature's limbs on the stone beyond, a dreadful lullaby promising an end. Dr. Kearns had grown eerily quiet, his eyes glazed and staring into nothingness. His body trembled as though fighting a current only he could feel. I reached out, my gloved hand brushing his arm, but he didn't react. The murmured whispers that had tormented us were now a relentless storm behind my temples, words I could not understand but felt sinking into my very marrow. Sacrifice, sacrifice. We were never meant to leave. Ellis stood at the edge of the corridor, her face lit by the wavering glow. Her expression was a mask of determination, fractured by fear. "We need to keep moving," she whispered, though the words seemed futile. There was nowhere to go. The corridor behind us was collapsing. The path before us led only deeper into the unknown. The roar of the creature had ceased, but it was a false comfort. The silence was its promise, a predator's patience. Suddenly, the walls trembled with a low, guttural groan, and a new sound emerged, a skittering as if thousands of limbs were scraping against stone. The glow from the veins intensified, brightening the corridor until it was almost blinding. I shielded my eyes, blinking away spots as shadows danced around us like mocking phantoms. Then I saw it, an appendage, longer and more grotesque than any we had encountered, snaked its way into the corridor. It was covered in scales that glistened with a wet sheen, eyes embedded along its length that blinked and rolled independently. The sight was wrong, fundamentally wrong, as if reality had splintered and let in something that did not belong. Kearns moved for the first time, his face contorting into a grotesque smile, eyes unfocused but brimming with a strange, resigned calm. "It's calling," he said, his voice hollow and distant. It always was. Before any of us could react, he stood, his limbs moving as if they belonged to someone else. He staggered forward, his eyes locked on the writhing appendage. "Kearns, no!" I shouted, lunging for him, but my fingers only grazed his suit as he stepped into the tendril's path. The appendage coiled around him with a fluid grace, pulling him into the light as he laughed, the sound rising in pitch until it broke into silence. A low hum vibrated through the chamber as the appendage pulled Kearns into the dark beyond, and for a heartbeat, there was only the sound of my own pulse, drumming a frantic beat in my ears. Then came the scream, raw and jagged, echoing off the stone and splintering the fragile remnants of my resolve. It was the scream of a man who had seen beyond the veil, and in that scream, I heard the death of hope. Ellis turned to me, her eyes wild, teeth gritted in a snarl of defiance and despair. "We're not going to let it end like this." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. We both knew the truth. The fight was already lost. We were mice scurrying in the house of a god. A crack split the air and the corridor shuddered as the floor buckled beneath us. I fell, arms flailing as the ground gave way, and suddenly I was sliding down a jagged slope into darkness, the light of the veins stretching like desperate fingers above me. I hit the bottom hard, pain jolting up my side as the world blurred and spun. The room I landed in was vast, an antechamber deeper than I could fathom, carved with the same maddening glyphs that had haunted us since we arrived. But here, in this forsaken place, the carvings moved. Twisted figures writhed across the walls, their faces locked in expressions of torment, mouths agape as if caught mid-scream. The veins glowed a deep, throbbing red, pulsing with the beat of some ancient, alien heart. Ellis landed beside me with a grunt, rolling onto her back, eyes wide as she took in our surroundings. We were trapped, surrounded by stone and madness. The air was dense, heavy with the scent of iron and rot and something else, a presence that made my skin crawl. The hum had returned, louder now, vibrating through my bones, and with it came the sound of shifting stone. The center of the room opened slowly, splitting like a wound, and from it rose the creature. No longer just a slithering appendage, but the full horror of its form. It towered over us, a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and eyes, churning with liquid darkness. It opened what I could only assume was a mouth, an abyss lined with serrated, glistening teeth. And from it came a sound that was not a roar, but a chorus of voices, screaming in unison. Ellis stood, drawing herself up, a last defiant act against the inevitable. "If we die here, let it be fighting," she said, her voice trembling but unyielding. She raised her arm, clutching the last flare from her belt, and ignited it. The red light flared bright, casting long, terrifying shadows across the chamber. The creature recoiled, its many eyes narrowing against the light. For a moment, there was silence, and then a new sound. A crackling as if the stone itself was laughing. The creature surged forward, enveloping Ellis in a shroud of writhing limbs. She struggled, the flare still burning in her grasp, her face locked in a mask of agony and fierce resolve. I watched, paralyzed as she was consumed, her light snuffed out like a dying star. And then there was only me. The creature turned its eye to me, and I felt the world blur around its gaze. My knees buckled as the whispers returned, stronger now, drilling into my mind with relentless precision. "You were never meant to leave. You are the offering." My vision darkened at the edges, the pulsing glow dimming as my consciousness slipped. As the cold seeped into my bones, the last thing I saw was the creature lowering itself, tendrils coiling around me as the chamber walls closed in. The glyphs shimmered one final time, their tortured figures frozen mid-scream, a cruel testament to those who dare to uncover the ancient secrets of Titan. And then, silence. The kind of silence that stretched beyond the stars, into the black, endless void where gods and monsters waited to be awoken once more.